Tonight's guest speaker, Greg Braun, is the Executive Director of the Guardians of Martin County. Greg is a board-certified environmental professional with a Bachelor of Science in Oceanography from Florida Institute of Technology and more than 20 years of experience working on environmental projects here in Florida and throughout the Caribbean. Greg specializes in avian and coastal ecology, as well as habitat restoration work. He's worked with a variety of threatened and endangered species, including gopher tortoises, manatees, and scrub jays. Tonight, Greg's going to be telling us about an important land preservation initiative right here in Martin County. It is with my greatest pleasure that I welcome to the stage Greg Braun.
Great, thanks, Zach, and welcome everyone. I'm certainly pleased to have been offered the opportunity to speak to you this evening about this local initiative. I know Zach and Florida Oceanographic, this coastal lecture series attracts people from not just Martin County, but from all over. So certainly for those who are local to the Martin County area, this is going to be information that is directly applicable to all of you. But for those who are from out of the area and might not be familiar with Martin County, it'll certainly give you an idea about land conservation initiatives in Florida. We're going to talk a little bit about wetlands and habitats and habitat fragmentation. We're going to talk a little bit about what the difference is between parks and preserves. But the bottom line is the message is about controlling our own destiny as far as land conservation goes. So I've got about 30 slides that we're going to work through, and Zach has asked me to leave at least 30 minutes at the end here for questions and answers. So with that, let's go ahead and get to the program, which is indeed the Loxa-Lucie Headwaters. And if you can, Zach, just confirm that my first slide is up on the screen so everybody can see it.
Looks fantastic.
Okay. So the Loxa-Lucie Headwaters Initiative, and we're going to take this apart because I'm going to talk about the Loxahatchee. I'm going to talk about the St. Lucie River. I'm definitely going to talk about headwaters, and I'm going to talk about an initiative because this indeed is a grassroots groundswell effort. But let's start off with headwaters because that's the picture that I've got here in the center. You know, we hear a lot about headwaters. Those of you here in Martin County, you hear talk about the headwaters of the Kissimmee River leading to the problems that we've had in Lake Okeechobee. You may know about the initiative to acquire some properties up in the headwaters of the Everglades. But headwaters is kind of a difficult concept for people to understand if you're not familiar with it. So what's in the center of my picture here on this drone taken photo, this is what headwaters are. You know, they're not the pretty rivers that you're going to be kayaking down or paddle boarding down. This is what they look like. They're areas that have water during the rainy season, and it may flow somewhere via sheet flow, or during the dry season there may not be much water there at all. And it goes squish when you walk through it, but this is what leads to those waters that you can ultimately paddle down and recreate on. So just to give you an idea of the boundaries of our project, which as you saw from that last slide encompasses about 60,000 acres worth of property. Generally, we are bounded on the north by Cove Road and the Atlantic Ridge Preserve State Park that you see right here, and on the south by Jonathan Dickinson State Park. So this is all east of I-95, although some of the watershed is certainly outside of my little purple boundary, and we're bounded on the east by essentially the development on the west side of the US 1 corridor. And it's getting its name Loxa-Lucie because of our interest here in preserving water that's going down through Kitching Creek into the Loxahatchee River, so flowing south, and the waters that are up here in the northwestern part of our project area that flow into the South Fork. So we're going to talk a little bit about the water quality there as well. And I'm going to bring your attention to the small parcel that I've highlighted in yellow here, because we're going to come back to that, because that's the first acquisition that our initiative has recently closed on. But before that, let me just talk to you about overall the conservation issues in Martin County. And you're first going to note up here at the top that this is not a new graphic. This was from back over a decade ago, August 2011. And at that time, a variety of these lands, not only in other areas of Martin County, but specifically within our project area, had been indeed identified as proposed acquisitions. So this is not a new concept at all. The reason it's an initiative now is locally we've gotten, I guess, disappointed that although these properties have been on the acquisition list for over a decade, we have had exactly 0 properties brought into public conservation. And as we all know, there's an intense pressure for development in Martin County, and as each day and month and year goes by, land values are going up, and we're afraid if we don't move forward with this, the opportunity for acquiring those properties and bringing them into public conservation is certainly going to be a challenge. So we don't need to go into all of the details of the properties here, but you see several of the green ones, the Atlantic Ridge Preserve State Park, Palmar, Alapata Flats, the big property up here in the northwestern part of the county. Those are indeed in public ownership right now. I'll also mention, just so everybody gets the idea of where it's located, we've seen a lot of public information recently about the opening of the C44 reservoir and STA. So this is the thousands of acres here on the north side of the C44 that has recently been open for water coming in, being cleaned up through the STA and the reservoir before it is discharged back into the C44. Our interest in this isn't merely hydrologic, though. This is a map, again, taken from back several years ago when, under contract to the Treasure Lands Foundation, the North Florida Land Trust went through a sort of an environmental analysis of all of the lands in Martin County. And we're certainly not going to go through them, but over on the right side of my slide here, you see the brainstorm list of parameters that were considered in trying to develop what turned out to be this sort of heat map that you see, where those lands with the highest environmental values are those that are shown in the brightest colors. So the bright reds and the oranges and the yellows, and those other properties that have less environmental value for whatever reason are those that are in the bluer shade. So let's just go back to that C44 reservoir and STA right here. You can see that one of the reasons that that property was selected as the water retention feature is it had very little environmental value and quality at that time. So it was a perfect location for this. So back to our project here, you see that a lot of bright reds, oranges, and yellows. That's sort of supporting that what we're trying to do is good not only hydrologically, but for the variety of reasons that you see over on the right-hand part of the screen. But what has really gotten us interested in this Loxa-Lucie initiative is the fact that the state park system has identified that these properties are ones that they would like to own and manage as part of the state park system. So I don't know the extent to which any of you are knowledgeable about the state parks process, but each state park in the system is required to put together what they call a unit management plan. It's a plan that goes through public review, public input, and ultimately is approved through the state Department of Environmental Protection and ultimately to the governor and cabinet as the way that that state park should be managed. It goes through and it identifies the different kinds of habitats. It talks about the endangered species, the plants and the animals, and the vegetative communities, just all these different things. Well, one component that they are required to evaluate is something that they call the optimal boundary. And so the park is charged with saying, if money were no object, what properties would we have within our system that would help us manage our own property? And probably an excellent example is if a state park has a river running through it, indeed, they would like to be able to control the waters within that watershed so that they can be somewhat assured that there isn't going to be polluted water coming down through that land. So what I have for you on this particular slide, on the left is the optimal boundary map for the Atlantic Ridge Preserve State Park. And so you see the state park properties here in the blue cross hatching, and you see in the red diagonal hatching those properties that the state park system would indeed like to own to help them manage their own property. So those are properties, as you can see from the yellow oval, that are within our project area. Similarly, although not a lot of people know about Atlantic Ridge Preserve State Park, and we're going to talk about that in just a minute, but most people are familiar with Jonathan Dickinson. And so the graphic on the right-hand side of the slide here is indeed the optimal boundary map from the management plan for Jonathan Dickinson State Park. And you see that there are thousands of acres of wetlands on the west, some lands on the south, and indeed part of what we're interested in here is the connector going from the existing park up to Bridge Road that you see at the north end in white, which is also the corresponding black line on this. So indeed, what we're trying to do, even though these properties, these state park properties, have been acquired decades apart, what our project is trying to do is indeed bring the connector linkage between those state parks. So the bottom line is that we, the advocates for this project, we don't own land, we don't manage land, we're not interested in doing so, but we know that the state is. And so the idea is we're trying to help bring this into public ownership so that it can then be turned over to the state. So let's move on to that, because the state of Florida's mechanism for acquiring properties, whether it's new state parks or additions to existing state parks, is a program that many of you are probably familiar with called the Florida Forever program. So it's a highly competitive statewide program where they have thousands of acres that are on their desired acquisition list. And so they identify project names for each of these. And although I'm speaking to you tonight on behalf of the LoxaLucie, the Florida Forever project name for this area is the Atlantic Ridge ecosystem. And indeed, the headwaters that we're talking about is part of the Atlantic Ridge ecosystem. The reason we have opted for the LoxaLucie name for our program is that most of the ridge, the high, dry, sandy ridge, is over here on the east side. And it is already either preserved, as it is in Jonathan Dickinson, or it's developed lands here between Jonathan Dickinson and over in the US 1 corridor. So although we certainly like the name Atlantic Ridge ecosystem, we think the Loxa-Lucie Headwaters, which are these wetlands in green that we're trying to bring into conservation, ownership, and management, we think that's the more appropriate title for the project. So this is all a willing seller project, the Florida Forever program. There's no eminent domain capabilities, and the idea is you're looking at properties that are actively for sale and then trying to raise the funds to be able to bring those through the willing seller negotiations into conservation ownership. Another reason for our interest in this is some of you may have heard about the Florida Wildlife Corridor project. It was started a number of years ago, And although we're just over here on the eastern fringe, what has gotten the most amount of publicity about the whole program is those properties that are on the west side of Lake Okeechobee, going up through the Kitching Creek area. It branches off here for an easterly corridor and a westerly corridor going all the way up through the Panhandle to Alabama. So you don't hear so much about our project, but I wanted to confirm that indeed these properties within the Loxa-Lucie are part of that wildlife corridor. And for good reason, because I've got a slide here in a little bit that talks about how the various wildlife are indeed using this as a corridor between the state park and the Atlantic Ridge Preserve State Park. So this is a very similar map, but I've got a different base map here. This is a Google Earth image, and I thought it was important so that we could see the underlying habitats that are in here. So again, Atlantic Ridge Preserve State Park here in the green, the two different segments. This eastern one they actually call the Medalist property, and it is managed by the South Florida Water Management District. And you see that is indeed the historic part of the ridge, the Sand Ridge area that continues down through Jonathan Dickinson, as opposed to, as I mentioned before, the wetlands that are in this area that are primarily the headwater areas for the South Fork up here and in through Kitching Creek coming down this way. So that's very definitely all those wetlands, and that's why this area has not been developed in the past. Martin County, as many of you will know, has some of the most stringent wetland protection standards in the state of Florida. Each one of those wetlands, if this property were to be developed, a jurisdictional delineation would need to be done about where the boundary of the wetland is. The county would require that the wetland be preserved and that there also be a buffer adjacent to those wetlands that would also be preserved and managed in perpetuity. So what that has meant is that the development potential for this property, up until recently when the pandemic has really changed things, the economic profit margin is so small that this has not been, up until recently, highly desirable land. I mentioned the county having a strict wetland protection standards. Another reason that sets Martin County off from a variety of the other counties, especially here in Southeast Florida, is the unwillingness by the county commissions over the years to deviate from or modify what they have referred to as the Urban Services District. So there are lines on the map that essentially say, we believe that for economic reasons, it's most economically profitable to develop within this urban services boundary, and we're going to develop within this boundary before we start leapfrogging or expanding that urban services district. So indeed, the boundary is right here. You can see some housing development just to the east of our boundary, and this area is outside that urban services district where the county makes it exceedingly difficult for anyone to develop. So the profit margin hasn't been there. These areas are wetlands, but I mentioned the pandemic has certainly changed things. There's a much higher interest in land development, and so that's part of the reason that we're interested in moving forward with this as really as soon as we can. Similarly, we see these lands on the west side of Jonathan Dickinson, and if you remember back to my optimal boundary map for Jonathan Dickinson, you see that these wetlands and the other areas that are within the watershed that would flow easterly in towards Kitching Creek are part of what the state park system would like to own and manage. So why is it so important that we're trying to do this? You just need to look at these two graphics. This is a Google Earth image of Bridge Road from essentially a mile or two east of I-95, looking towards the east. You see there that we've got generally intact habitats. Yes, there have been some drainage efforts of one kind or another. You see an old wetland here that's been drained in some areas used for agriculture, but essentially the skeleton of the natural system is still intact. Just a couple miles to the south of this is the corresponding exit, next exit to the south on Indiantown Road at Jupiter, again looking east from a mile or so east of the I-95 interchange. So you see there is a little bit of a semblance of some natural communities here and Tidal Creek up here with a lot of mangroves that were protected. But essentially we have lost the ecological integrity of the areas on both sides of that road. And so what we're trying to do is, while this is still a 2-lane highway, land values are comparatively lower than in the more urbanized area. This is what we're trying to acquire and do some hydrologic restoration and preserve those areas. So that's kind of the basic outline of what we're trying to do. I know that many of you who are tuned in to the Florida Oceanographic series here are very interested in what's there on the land, you know, the bugs and the bunnies, or in this case, the birds and the bobcats and the wading birds, some endangered plants and that sort of thing. So I'm going to spend some time talking about why we believe that this project will benefit those various species. So we're going to start off talking about some of the vegetative communities that are in here. And certainly much of this has been taken from the management plan for Atlantic Ridge Preserve State Park, which I like to say is one of the best kept secrets in Martin County. Who knew that there would be thousands of acres of conserved lands right here off of Cove Road? Now, the state doesn't make it easy to get to, and that's why I'm going to make a little bit of a distinction here between Jonathan Dickinson State Park and that designation of park, which has some preserve area, but essentially an emphasis on the recreational opportunities for the property, as opposed to Atlantic Ridge Preserve State Park, where the focus is on the natural communities. And yes, there is some recreation allowable on there, whether it's low impact hiking or mountain biking or horseback riding, but it's certainly not the recreational opportunity that Jonathan Dickinson presents. But let's talk just a little bit about the different kinds of habitats that are within the state park system and the properties that we're trying to acquire. Certainly some wet flatwoods, depression marshes, prairies, mixed upland forest, some cypress domes, which in this area is kind of an unusual feature, and indeed some areas that are either former or currently in pasture. So just a little bit about these vegetative communities, what it looks like on the ground. These wet flatwoods, primarily the dominant tree vegetation in here is the slash pine. There's palmettos in the understory in the drier areas, and then a lack of palmettos when the ground surface is a little bit lower. As opposed to the live oaks that are up on more of the sandy and drier soils, these are laurel oaks that we have primarily on the forested portions of this property. And yes, unfortunately, we do have a variety of non-native invasive vegetation. Melaleucas in the wetlands, the climbing fern, Lygodium, ear-leafed acacia, just a variety of those things. And I think that's one of the other reasons that we're interested in this, is right now the property owners have no real incentive to do any control of these non-native invasives. But once we're able to bring them into conservation ownership and stewardship, we'll be able to deal with those. And so there will be spillover effects in that it's no doubt the seeds from these invasives on our side of the property line that are causing problems on the state park lands sides. So a little bit about depression marshes, and indeed that's what this sort of a community is, and even this area. a depression marsh in the wetland wet season looks like this. Those little wetlands fill right up, and we'll have standing water for several months out of the year. They're a prime area for a variety of wetland species, plant and animal species. So I've got here indeed the white water lily, some spatterdock or yellow pond lily, a button bush, one of these shrubs that would be growing out here on the edges. Pickerel weed is another one, and pond apple. There's also coastal plain willow out here in the middle. It's kind of interesting. I've been living this project for the last 2.5 years or so, and so I actually put this photo up as the screensaver on my computer. And it really wasn't until I started staring at it at times that if you take a look in here real closely, you see this little matted area of gray vegetation. Now, I'm not going to say for sure, but it certainly looks to me like a sandhill crane nest. And this is the perfect sort of habitat for nesting sandhill cranes. They build their nest in those wetland areas. They gather the vegetation from the surrounding area. They build up that nest, and the idea is that they nest in those wetlands because it protects their nest and eggs from ground predators. It's going to be a pretty determined fox or a raccoon or bobcat or whatever that would actually be wading or swimming out through these wetlands to get to that sort of a nesting area. But it takes the proximity of the nesting area to adjacent foraging areas for that nesting attempt by sandhill cranes to be effective. They forage in low grass kinds of areas, which unfortunately is why we see them foraging along roadsides and that sort of thing. But this is the natural sort of community that they would be successful in. Nest here, away from the predators, forage and bring your young in to forage and learn the ways of life in the more upland areas. So wet prairies is sort of a similar sort of a community, but it is a little bit different hydrology, different amount of water, and so these are representatives of some of those species that plant species that inhabit that sort of an area. High species diversity. If any of you know about the Kissimmee Prairie Preserve State Park, it indeed is mostly wet prairie with a whole variety of herbaceous species. Just a couple that I'm going to flag for you here. This one is called the alligator lily, endemic plant only found in Florida, I think maybe even the southern half of the peninsula. So we've got this certainly on our properties. Skyflower, a couple other wildflowers of one kind or another. And this real outstanding native lily called the Pineland Lily, which is indeed on the state's protected list as a threatened species. We're going to shift now to a little bit about water quality. Certainly that's a hot topic of interest in the Martin County area. And yes, indeed, this picture I took on the South Fork back a number of years ago, when indeed these probably high school students were having their own sort of Huck Finn experience, a homemade raft going down the South Fork. Well, unfortunately, as most of you know, these days, this is what we've got. The water is, don't touch it for one reason or another. This particular headline that I clipped and scanned from the Stewart News from TC Palm back in December of 2020 had a bacterial warning. Well, sometimes it's that. Other problems are certainly nutrient related. And so part of that is no doubt what's coming down the C44 from Lake Okeechobee, but a lot of that is also water from our own drainage basin. So let's talk a little bit about what's going on here in the South Fork. So this is a watershed boundary map for the South Fork, or for the whole St. Lucie River. So the South Fork coming down to the south here, the North Fork going up this way, the estuary here, and then coming out to the Indian River Lagoon over on the east side. So that you see, of all of these drainage basins, certainly this South Fork Basin that we're talking about and the properties that we're trying to bring into conservation is the largest of those drainage basins at over 40,000 acres. So I'm sort of poaching a couple of slides from others to help demonstrate the water quality situation we've got. And so I want to thank Judd and Zach and the Florida Oceanographic Society for their Citizens Water Quality Monitoring Program. For those of you, some of you may be participants in the water sampling, but for those of you who don't know about it, every week they're doing water sampling out here in the South Fork, the North Fork, and the IRL, and they weekly publish these maps that give us an idea of what the quality of the water is in each of these different areas. So this one was back from the week of September 23rd to the 29th of 2021. And you see they've made it easy for us here. No cross-hatching and all that. Green is good and red is bad. And so you see in the South Fork and the winding South Fork, this part here, destructive in water quality. And you may say, well, that's because we've got discharges from the C44 and Lake Okeechobee. But take a look at this one. This, again, from September, this one goes back to 2020, but it shows the example of when the C44 is not discharging, we still have horrendous water quality here in the winding South Fork of the St. Lucie. So indeed, it's the agricultural lands and other developed lands adjacent to the river here that are no doubt contributing to the poor water quality in this area. So we believe if we're able to bring these other properties into conservation, along with what the state and the county are trying to do through the basin management action plans to try to resolve some of these problems with water quality, that we may get a better handle on it. So I now want to give some credit to some very recent research that has just come out from the Ocean Research Conservation Association. Some of you may know ORCA. The Guardians of Martin County that I work with is one of the entities that has made a number of financial contributions, because we believe, as they do, that you have to know the science. You know, a lot of these people say, oh, we know what the science is, you got to clean up the pollution. Well, that's true. We do want to remove the muck from the river and other kinds of things like that, but we know we don't have the money to do it all. We have to prioritize where we're going to get the biggest bang for the bucks. So if you haven't done so already and you don't know about ORCA, I've put their website in here at the bottom, and take a look at their recent study on the South Fork of the St. Lucie. So those of you who may not be familiar with the area, this is the Roosevelt Bridge just north of the top of the slide here. Here is the existing Palm City Bridge, and this is the new Veterans Memorial Bridge. So ORCA has gone through, and they have kind of an interesting, it's expensive, but an interesting way of doing the water sampling. You know, it's not just go out and do a grab sample and analyze it. They have these things called Kilroys that are continuous sampling and recording equipment. The piece of equipment is out there. It's recording not only during periods of rainfall, but during the dry season, when we have a hurricane, whatever it is, and it allows them to be able to figure out where indeed these hot spots of different pollutants are. So I pulled out just a couple of representative maps. I don't have them all. They've got ones on heavy metal. They've got ones on a variety of things. But normally we think of phosphorus and nitrogen being our biggest pollutants of our surface waters and leading to the water quality problems that we have. So let's just look at phosphorus first. You know, I was very surprised to see, you know, in this case, kind of like my other heat map from before, the brighter reds are the biggest problem areas. So you see, for phosphorus in the South Fork, we don't have that much of a problem. It's overall pretty good. You know, a little bit of a hot spot up here off of, I think this is Poppleton Creek, but generally not too bad of a problem. Not so with nitrogen. And so the ORCA Kilroys have identified a number of hot spots here. And the idea is now that we know where these hot spots are, that's when some attempts can be gone through, evaluated, and figure out how do we address these so that ultimately we can turn those red and orange hot spots down into blue areas that aren't so much of a problem. I don't know that we've talked in this year's FOS series about the problems with herbicides, but certainly those of you who are following the situation have recognized that the use of various pesticides and herbicides and other chemicals are contributing to some of the water quality problems that we have. So this is an interesting study, portion of the study that ORCID did, showing the concentrations of glyphosate, one of these chemicals that is a breakdown product of the herbicide use. So again, it helps us identify where these issues are that we need to kind of figure out what's the source of this, and can we try some other invasive species management processes to try to prevent or reduce the amount of glyphosate and other herbicides in the runoff from those areas. So all this information, just like the FOS information on the last slide, it's all available on their websites. And Dr. Beth Falls from ORCID just gave about an hour-long presentation in a similar sort of presentation like this that is posted on their website, and where she goes into a lot more details about this overall study. So that information was relevant to the South Fork of the St. Lucie. And I don't know if ORCA has done anything in the Loxahatchee or not, but let's just kind of take a step down to the southerly watershed here. So again, here's the boundary of our project. This is the Loxahatchee River. And so the folks that have the database on water quality in the Loxahatchee River are primarily the Loxahatchee River Environmental Control District, normally called the Loxahatchee River District. So they have gone through the Loxahatchee River, and they have separated it up into these dozen or so different watershed basins. And so our project area is within basin number 1, the Kitching Creek watershed, coming down this way into the northwest fork of the St. Lucie, and then an easterly flowway that comes down into the north fork of the Loxahatchee. So those of you who are local and you know about the problems with the Loxahatchee, this may be too much of a cursory overview. But what the Loxahatchee River District has done is, after the designation of the Loxahatchee as a wild and scenic river, they really started honing in on kind of what's going on with that whole system. And so this part of my presentation is going to be twofold. It's going to be about saltwater intrusion, which is essentially what has killed off this cypress tree. Well, I say killed off, I don't know, this picture I took in January one year, and so bald cypress are indeed deciduous, and so it could be that it's just lost its leaves, but for the winter time. But overall, the process is that the freshwater system in these upper stretches of the Loxahatchee have been adversely affected, such that we're seeing an upriver march of mangroves, which you can clearly see in this. This is a red mangrove with those prop roots hanging down. And so saltwater intrusion is happening, and part of what the Loxahatchee River District, and for those of you who know about it, there's something called the Loxahatchee River Management Coordinating Council. That's a mouthful, but essentially it is all the different state and federal organizations and conservation organizations. Anybody who has any interest in the Loxahatchee River is allowed to participate in this coordinating council. It's to make sure they've got communication between the other entities. And so there is a management plan for the Loxahatchee River, and specifically, as this has been identified, the saltwater intrusion problem has been identified. They're working in close coordination with the South Florida Water Management District to develop and implement what they call minimum flows and levels. they're recognizing that we've got to have a minimum amount of fresh water coming down into the system, or we're going to continue to lose those cypress trees, some of which are well over 100 years old. So just like the other entities are doing water quality monitoring in the South Fork, here are just a couple of maps that I've pulled out for water quality in the Northwest Fork of the Loxahatchee. Well, here's the Northwest Fork coming around this way, North Fork going this way, and then in the Hobe Sound and Jupiter Sound area. So the couple of maps that I pulled out for this one that I think are appropriate for us to talk about are indeed total nitrogen. The Loxalucie River District has these, I don't know, like 60 or 70 different water sampling points, and I took this one out of the restoration plan for the Northwest Fork. And you see here again, green is good, everything's looking pretty good in most of the system until you start getting up here in the northerly stretches of Kitching Creek. You know, bad water, bad nitrogen problems there, and even worse nitrogen problems up here. Phosphorus, again, not quite so bad of a problem. So a couple of yellow lights down here, but not too bad up here in the Kitching Creek watershed. Dissolved oxygen, though, another sort of bad news story for the upper stretches of the river. So the bottom line is there's a database out there going back for many years that show that we've got some water quality challenges in the Loxahatchee that we need to try to address. And part of that, I think, goes back to the overall watershed changes that we have had in the whole Bridge Road area. So here's Bridge Road, Jupiter Island and Hobe Sound over here to the east. Power Line Avenue here, going out towards I-95 that would be over here. So you see all those wetlands that had been present back in 1958 when I was able to get this aerial photo from the University of Florida's library system. So you see those wetlands, many of which are connected here and had flowed south down to the through Kitching Creek to the Loxahatchee, and during the wet season when these would be connected and they would flow northwesterly here towards the South Fork. So we're not going to change, the development that's taken place in here. We're not going to change that. Rooftops are rooftops and parking lots are parking lots. But while these properties are still either in natural habitat or they are in restorable habitat, that's why we're interested in moving forward with this project here on a timely basis. So what are we trying to do? Our first phase of the whole Loxahatchee Headwaters program is to identify those properties that are for sale and have these different environmental attributes. Yes, we want them to have restorable hydrology. They need to have some environmental habitat. And we like this corridor between the state parks, and preventing urban sprawl as part of it. Natural water flows. Several of you will be knowledgeable about the flooding that is a recurring problem in the Hobe Sound area. Again, going back to those large-scale hydrologic changes that have been made over the years. The saltwater intrusion down in the Loxahatchee. Certainly one of our goals here is to indeed enhance some recreational opportunities that right now, while they're privately owned, certainly those are limited. And we're going to talk a little bit about wildlife mortality here in a minute. But we went through our group, the steering committee that I'm on, and I'm going to identify a little bit later on who the different players and all this are. But we went through the evaluation of driving down Bridge Road, looking at every for sale sign and trying to figure out, okay, what parcel is it? How big is it? What's the market value of it? What's most important to us? And so we identified this 138 acre, 2 mile long stretch as our most desirable phase 1 acquisition. So we went off and did a pretty intensive fundraising campaign, and indeed, as you see up here, we were successful. Raised over $3 million for the acquisition of that property, and we closed last fall. It's not a particularly pretty piece of property, I'll have to say. It does have a lot of invasives, but unfortunately, Those invasives have come in because the water table has been drawn down. It was formerly used for agriculture. And so in our perspective, although it's ugly right now, it is restorable. Once you reset that natural ground elevation, water table elevation, most of those invasives are going to go away. They don't like the wet conditions of restored wetlands. They like the areas that are in the currently drained condition. So that was our number one priority, and we thank all of you who made donations or were in some way responsible for helping us purchase and protect that wetland. And just as a matter of reference here, this particular map looks a little bit different than the others that I've shown to you, but this is a FEMA map. You know, FEMA looks at what's the likelihood of properties getting flooded. And so they have done their own wetland mapping, and you see all the wetlands that are in here. You can't see the ones under the property that we bought, but indeed they were there, which is part of the reason that we wanted that parcel. But the main reason that we wanted it is because it controls this central flowway down through Kitching Creek and into the northwest fork of the Loxahatchee. There is this easterly flowway, which mostly is protected already, and it's not for sale. So our project, again, is limited to willing sellers. I mentioned wildlife mortality issues, and kind of a sad story out of all this is that once our group started looking into this and trying to figure out more about what's going on the land and looking at water flow and all that, we started driving Bridge Road a lot more frequently. And I was disappointed at seeing dead bird after dead otter after raccoon and possums and one thing or another. And so we thought, wow, I wonder if anybody knows that this road is as deadly for wildlife as it is. There had already been one human fatality over here at the east side. But we undertook a study to go out and indeed do some, collect some actual metrics on what's going on here. And so that you see during our period of 15 months or so, we had over 650 animal mortalities, mammals, birds, reptiles, amphibians. We've talked with the county because indeed Bridge Road is a county-owned and managed road. And they certainly are responsive. They're sympathetic to what's going on. They have looked at possibly replacing culverts with wildlife crossings and things like that. It's expensive to do. It's not an easy solution because of the high water table and the comparatively low ground elevations. So they've done the first step in all this. They put out some watch for wildlife signs. We hope that will address some of the problem, but we actually extended our study by several months to continue the evaluation after the county put up the signs. And as you might expect, there was no significant change in the number of wildlife mortalities. So it is a problem. We're working with the county through the Public Works department to try to sort it out. Sheriff's Department is also engaged because there have been indeed a number of human fatalities along here. Certainly our hope in the long term is for a wildlife crossing, of which there are several in our area. Some of you may know about the Florida panther that got killed over on the Beeline 2 years or so ago. And this is a picture of a wildlife crossing from down on Indiantown Road in Jupiter by Riverbend Park. Big enough for people to indeed walk under, hike under. I don't know that you could ride a horse under it, but you could walk your horse under it. So back to what we're trying to do with this. I've mentioned several times water management, trying to restore the hydrology and deal with some of those pollutants. But I haven't talked about recreational opportunities. Ultimately, certainly hiking is doable from Jonathan Dickinson to Atlantic Ridge. We think that there can be some viewing stations out looking over the wetlands where I've seen snail kites and other birds of interest. And ultimately, they do horseback riding with a concessionaire at Jonathan Dickinson. And although they don't have a concessionaire at Atlantic Ridge Preserve State Park, you can bring your own horse and go horseback riding there. So our hope would be that if we're successful in acquiring these properties, ultimately somebody could indeed horseback ride from one to the other. So I've mentioned several times about we doing this and we doing that, and some of you may be interested in, well, who is we? And so I mentioned that this is a grassroots effort. My role of this is through my position as executive director of the Guardians of Martin County, a nonprofit organization, been around for over a decade or so. And generally, what we're interested in is endorsing or supporting responsible development and growth management. We're partnering with this with the Treasured Lands Foundation, a Hobe Sound-based land trust that has been also in existence for a number of years. And they have been most active in acquiring a property that's known as the Hobe Sound Scrub Preserve right now over off of Dixie Highway. And neither of us are interested in the long-term ownership and management of property. We're conservation advocates, but the entity that we have brought in to help us out with kind of the technology and the knowledge behind how to go about doing these sort of land conservation programs is a state nationwide company called the Conservation Fund. They're the entity that is accepting tax-deductible donations to all of this. And so I've got on this slide, if anyone is interested, how you could make a contribution. And it is through the Conservation Fund. We just happen to have the regional vice president for the southeastern U.S. who lives on Sewell's Point and has been knowledgeable and involved with Loxa-Lucie River things for decades. And so if you're interested in making a contribution towards that, you could look on the Conservation Fund's website, just type in LoxaLucie and it would take you to a page about that. So as part of this, we're establishing this group called the Friends of the Loxa-Lucie. And so it's through that we're offering these kinds of programs. We've got some printed materials and that sort of thing. Just a little bit about the Conservation Fund, because I had heard of them, but they certainly don't have the name recognition like the Nature Conservancy and other entities, but they have been quietly going about their work for decades here. So they've protected over 8 million acres worth of land throughout the United States. And here in Florida, they've had a number of projects where they've protected over 135,000 acres worth of land, including several here in the Treasure Coast area. They're the ones that have the knowledge about how to negotiate with property owners and how to do conservation easements and all those sorts of things. So we're very appreciative of the involvement of Matt Sexton in this project. We're going to talk a little bit about the timing for all this, which unfortunately was horrendous with the pandemic. It has certainly negatively affected our ability to go do outreach to the community. But over the past couple of years, we have indeed been successful in outreaching to a variety of governmental, environmental NGOs, and just other entities, homeowners associations, and that sort of thing. And we have been overwhelmingly pleased with the level of support from these different entities. Certainly when the Martin County Commission voted unanimously to support our project, that was a major accomplishment. For those of you who follow politics in Martin County, those 5 commissioners don't often agree unanimously on much of anything, but they unanimously supported our project. Similarly, a number of the municipalities have. Town of Jupiter Island, certainly Tequesta there in the Loxa-Lucie River watershed. City of Stuart recognizing that none of our property is within the city boundary, but they will benefit from this water quality wise if we're able to indeed bring these properties into conservation ownership and hydrologic restoration. A couple of other municipalities there, Town of Sewell's Point, and I gave a presentation to the Treasure Coast Council of Local Government. So that includes not only those governmental entities here in these municipalities, but further north and south as well, and so they were supportive. It's probably not surprising that a variety of the water quality advocate groups and environmental non-governmental organizations have indeed supported us as well. We were pleased to get an endorsement by the Rivers Coalition. Those of you who are familiar with that group of over 100 organizations, all concerned about water quality in the Stewart-St. Lucie Indian River Lagoon area. The Indian River Lagoon National Estuary Program endorsed this. I mentioned Loxa-Lucie River Management Coordinating Council, the local Audubon chapter, and the Native Plant Society as well. And some other groups, I just put other here because they don't really fit into any specific category, but we've got some homeowners associations, certainly the Friends of Jonathan Dickinson, garden clubs, historical society, golf club. So if some of you viewers this evening are engaged with some group like that would have an interest in this, I'd love to make this column so long that I've got to have a tiny font because we've just got so many organizations that are helpful. So a little bit about the timeline here. We started this whole initiative back in 2019 when the Guardian's Board of Directors agreed to move forward with this and be a sponsor of it. You see the progress that we have made, continuing to advocate for the re-ranking of the Atlantic Ridge project. We're here right now continuing this outreach, and we thank Zach and FOS for allowing us this opportunity. And the reason I was running a little bit barely on time for this is I was just at the county commission meeting today, virtually all day, when they have agreed to move forward with putting a ballot item on the November, well, we suspect November election to allow the voters of Martin County to determine whether or not they would agree to an increase in the local sales tax to acquire these kinds of conservation lands. So just almost close here. I just want to show Martin County has a reputation for being green, and each one of these P's is a park area. I've also got Jonathan Dickinson and others in here. And many of these have been acquired because Martin County voters have voted affirmatively in the past to tax themselves, either ad valorem property or increases in sales tax or whatever it be, to acquire these properties. And so what the county is moving forward with here is creating a new funding mechanisms through which we could use the locally generated monies as a contribution towards state acquisition of these other properties. So finally here, just an acknowledgement slide. The entities that have decided to kind of spearhead this are the Guardians of Martin County and the Treasured Lands Foundation. And I'll say that we started this after the passing of Nathaniel Reed. He was a big advocate for public conservation lands. He recognized that in areas such as Martin County, if you don't buy it, sooner or later it's going to get developed. And so this was an initiative that started after his passing. The Conservation Fund and the Pegasus Foundation has contributed funds towards the wildlife aspects of this, and we're grateful for that. And I've identified the various names of the members of our steering committee here, and so some of those names may ring a bell with some of you. Feel free to reach out to any of those people if you're interested. And finally, all endorsers and donors. When we started this off, we had a mountain decline, but as each one of those endorsements has come in, it has given our group more credibility, and we've gotten hundreds of donations everywhere from $10 on up. So we're pleased with the success of that outreach. So with that, I got a little bit after 7:30, but hopefully I've got plenty of time here to answer questions that anybody might have. So I think, Zach, you're going to handle questions for me?
Yeah, you bet. Greg, thank you so much. That was a really, really neat program, and it's such an important and timely story to tell. And I'm thrilled that you were able to make it out of that county commission meeting in time to get here right at the buzzer. So you just talked about donations. One of our first questions is about donors, and this viewer is curious as to where the majority of your donations have come from so far, specifically for the property that's already been purchased?
I'd say probably the majority of them have come from the Hobe Sound area, Hobe Sound and Jupiter Island. I think the people who drive Bridge Road routinely and they see for sale sign after for sale sign after for sale sign, and then a lot that gets cleared for development, those are the folks who kind of see the reality of the situation being, if we don't buy it, it's going to get lost. So I'd say probably the bulk of the donations have come in through the Hobe Sound and Jupiter Island area. Folks from Loblolly and some of the other subdivisions in that area certainly are ones as well. And we were very pleased to have gotten a matching grant to start all this off. Several $100,000 commitment that if we were able to raise $1 million towards this, they were going to put a big chunk of money into it. So that gave us the incentive to really start this outreach that has led to us being successful in that initial acquisition.
So next is more of a comment than a question, but it's from Martin County Audubon, just going on the record saying that they are in support of the project, exclamation point. So it's great to have some of the supporters watching our program tonight.
Great. Yes, thank you. We were glad to add them as an entity that endorsed the project.
You showed some maps earlier that were generated by Orca and their Kilroy network in the South Fork area. One of our viewers is wondering whether those hot spots in the Palm City area were around residential areas. And if so, do you think maybe septic tanks are causing some of those nutrient issues?
I would suspect that they are, but that's really a question that the folks who did the research and published the paper and gave the presentation would be best apt to be able to answer. So it was Dr. Beth Falls was the primary researcher on that out of Orca, and so I'd suggest talking with her. I think in general terms, I think we believe that the subdivisions that have gone in more recently and are subject to the current standards for drainage and one thing or another are generally less contributors towards the water quality problems than those subdivisions that were developed back, decades ago, that don't have the stormwater retrofits and that sort of thing. So I'm certainly going to give a plug for Martin County because they've been a leader in trying to identify what these problem areas are. And, it's highly controversial when they have to condemn someone's land, move them out of their house, and essentially take the property where those people used to live and create a stormwater retrofit project. But they have been successful in doing that, and the bottom line is that is what allows the drainage that would otherwise go right into the river to instead be gravity directed back into some kind of storage or retention feature where it can get treated before that water goes back to the South Fork. So I don't want to generalize in is it adjacent to this neighborhood or that neighborhood. But certainly with Orca's maps, we know what those hot spots are, and we know what we ought to be trying to target for priority dealing with them.
In your opinion, can anything be done to add teeth to, or at least more consistent enforcement of, existing Florida environmental regulations?
Wow, that's tough. There are things that can be done. There have been attempts to do them. We know that the BMPs, the best management practices for some agricultural lands, are currently voluntary. And so the requirements for septic tank inspections have gone by the wayside. So there are a variety of things that can be done. I think the reality of it is it's our elected officials who need to hear from their constituents that we need these things to be done, or else we're going to continue on what I certainly perceive as a downhill slide.
All right, kind of a good follow-in to that. The Martin County Commission today approved a comprehensive plan change that will allow a rural lifestyle designation to be sought for agricultural lands. That would allow for an increased density of from one home per 20 acres to 5+ homes in the same land. This would apply to 180,000 acres of county land. Palm Beach County's experience with similar programs was a failure. I see this as an additional threat to our water. What is your view?
That's another good question,
Yeah.
and this is probably from somebody that I saw there in the audience today, or maybe someone who spoke during the public comment period about it. It is a challenging issue. I think I'll agree with several of the speakers who said that any conversion of what would currently be one home per 20 acres to essentially a fourfold increase in density has the potential to cause more problems from a water quality perspective. So there certainly are challenges that way. The Guardians have been trying to work with the proponents of that particular comp plan amendment to address some of these shortcomings. And so it's been interesting as I've learned more about this. Orca had done a study back a couple years ago of an area up around Vero Beach where they did that same sort of water quality analysis, and they provided a heat map. And surprisingly, the golf course that was draining into the Indian River Lagoon up there did not show a hot spot. You know, most of us kind of think that golf courses are sources of pollution with nitrogen, various fertilizers. But indeed, their research up there showed that at that particular location, the golf course was not a problem. So I think what we all need to do is be perseverant in how we can use science and the increasing amount of science that we're learning to try to impress upon our elected officials what needs to be done. One of the big topics of discussion at today's commission meeting was something called advanced water treatment. You know, we know that packaged treatment plants of the design of decades ago don't really work to the satisfaction that we would want. The county has pretty much outlawed them now. But the provision that was included in today's proposed amendment is that advanced treatment systems that would allow water quality to the state standards to be used on these properties. Well, the concerns that I have are, yes, advanced treatment systems, they deal with nutrients, so you can deal with phosphorus and nitrogen. What they don't deal with, to the satisfaction that I would be comfortable for them being used out here outside the Urban Services District in Martin County, is the ongoing problem with non-nutrient related parameters, criteria. You know, we've got fish with birth control contamination. You know, pharmaceuticals are not cleaned up by septic tanks or most water quality treatment systems. And so we need to try to deal with that. Similarly, herbicides and pesticides, the chemicals from those don't get cleaned up. So there are some challenges certainly before any kind of a proposal like that would be ultimately approved. What the county commission did today, they didn't give it a final approval. What they said is they're going to transmit it up to Tallahassee. They're going to give us the opportunity to continue to work with staff to try to tighten this up a little bit. They've told us we can't, the product of this can't be any reduction in protection over and above what was proposed today, but it can be more restrictive. So what I'm certainly going to try to do is encourage people to point out these kinds of improvement opportunities. I know I and my team here on the steering committee, we can't think of everything. And if people have suggestions as to ways that we can improve that, and a couple of them came out during today's meeting, I think that there is the potential that, you know, possibly some good could come out of it.
You talk about pesticides and herbicides. We have a couple of questions about pesticides and herbicides. One of our viewers tonight wonders whether you have any issues with old world climbing fern in your area. And if so, do you have any recommendations for another method of treatment other than glyphosate?
Indeed, it is a problem. We have Lygodium on the 138-acre parcel that we have just closed on. And so the answer is it is a challenge. We have had a couple of different exotic species contractors come in and start evaluating that. We think it's going to be in the neighborhood of $300,000 just for dealing with the invasives on that property. That's if we were to deal with them through conventional means like the use of herbicides. But again, let's think back to why are the invasives there? It's because the hydrology isn't right. If it was indeed a high water table, that Lygodium and those Melaleuca and those Brazilian peppers wouldn't be in there. So we're hoping to partner with Martin County on the hydrologic restoration on that 138 acres. And if indeed we can mechanically remove some of those earleaf dicaceae and other natives, and then scrape out those areas that have low environmental value, reflood them, we're going to create the sort of hydrologic conditions that those invasives aren't going to like. Lygodium won't get started in areas that are underwater all the time. And so that would be our hope for one of the techniques to try to manage those.
All right, switching from herbicides to pesticides, one of our viewers wonders whether commercial pesticide treatments around their home for things like ants, termites, roaches could have impacts on local water quality.
I'm not a water quality expert. I'm an ecologist, but certainly my perspective is that yes, they would be harmful. So they're hard to come by, but do some searches there for non-chemical means of pest controls. There are some things that don't rely on essentially store-bought chemicals to control those kinds of things. I was dealing just this past weekend with a kind of unfortunate situation about a nesting owl that was found dead, and how were we going to deal with this? And unfortunately, in the neighborhood where the dead owl was found, they indeed have rodenticidal sources that rodents can come in and get poisoned. So there was no obvious trauma for how that owl died. Was it indeed because it had ingested a rodent that had ingested the rodenticide? So everything, the whole food chain ecosystem is all interconnected. So certainly my philosophy, maybe to the detriment of my neighbors here, is I don't use chemicals. We might put a little bit of fertilizer around the base of a fruit tree, but broadcast application of herbicides and pesticides to control other problems, until we get a handle on better control of stormwater runoff, use of chemicals is probably not the way to go.
During your program, you talked a little bit about water tables, and one of our viewers wonders, how do you go about restoring a water table?
Okay, certainly good question. If we see, I'm not going to go back to the aerial photos right now, but I showed one where I actually pointed out a historic wetland area on a property that is currently within our project area that is currently used for cattle grazing. If we're able to acquire it, what we would do is you do the hydrologic analysis, and if we looked at that particular slide, we would see that there's this little discolored something leading out of that wetland. Well, that was a probably legitimately, legally cleared drainage ditch that would drain off that wetland under an agricultural exemption. They're allowed to do that sort of thing, or certainly they were in the past, and create the kind of conditions where it is not so wet. The cows don't want to be walking around out there in the water, so dig this ditch, let it run off let the rainwater run off the property, and all of a sudden you have more area that is grazable pasture. So the techniques for doing the hydrologic restoration are a couple fold. Number one, the most expensive operation is you actually go in with heavy equipment, you take those little berms that are on the side of the ditch and you fill it back in so the water doesn't have any place to go. And that's essentially what has happened with the Kissimmee River restoration projects. If you've been following any of that, they took those 50-foot tall berms along the Kissimmee River and they pushed it back into the river to recreate the natural flows. So that's one way. It's expensive to do though. So the other thing, and this is what has been done on the Allapattah property, if people are knowledgeable about the tens of thousands of acres up in northwest Martin County. It's acquired. Martin County was one of the partners in it, and they said, we don't have enough money to go in and push all these ditches in and everything. So they just put in what's called a ditch plug. Just plug up where that water would drain off into something. In that particular location, it's the Water Management District Canal on the north side of the property. But just plug it up. The water doesn't have any place to go. It's not going to continue to flow out through that ditch. Instead, it's going to sit on the property. And so those are two of the techniques that we would be evaluating on our property. Certainly the challenge that we have on our 138 acre tract is it's only so wide. And what has to be done during the engineering analysis of how to go about doing the restoration is we cannot do anything that would flood our neighbors' properties. And so property to the north is part of that. And even Bridge Road to the south is part of that whole system. So we need to have the engineering analysis that would allow us to move forward with the increasing of the water levels on our property without affecting the adjacent ones, which is why we're so interested in the next phase of our acquisition, being the several thousand acres to the north of the 138 acre tract that we just purchased, because that's the one that makes the linkage all the way from Bridge Road to the existing Atlantic Ridge Preserve State Park. And the state has pretty much told us we need to have that interim piece before we're going to accept management responsibilities. Hopefully that answered the question.
All right. Has the city of Jensen Beach become involved with any of your efforts?
Jensen Beach is not incorporated, so there is essentially no city of Jensen Beach. It's unincorporated Martin County, so the endorsement by the Martin County Commission included the commissioner for that district. We have not reached out to the town of Ocean Breeze, which is the small municipality up in the Jensen Beach area. I think they've got a couple hundred residents in that area. We have not reached out to them yet, although they might have had a representative when I presented to the Treasure Coast Council of Local Governments.
Will a sales tax increase have any impact on your funding?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I didn't go into that. Maybe we got a minute or two here to talk about the Florida Forever program and why our project has languished in there. You know, I said it was very competitive. Our Atlantic Ridge Ecosystem project, it was ranked number 29 on their list. You know, you're only usually going to get funding for those top couple projects. So they have a very complicated matrix through which the state of Florida, and it's called the Acquisition and Restoration Council, the way they prioritize who's going to get money for what. Well, a couple of their key criteria are, number one, public support. And until I was there in October, they had not heard from anybody from Martin County on behalf of this project in over 10 years. Well, naturally, if there is a squeaky wheel, and if nobody's going to come and even say they want you to purchase the land in your neighborhood, they're not going to give it a high priority. And number two is financial considerations. For a project to move up to where it's going to get funded, the state wants to see that you get points in the area, the criteria called less than fee simple. So if the state can get the property for less than what the market value would be, all of a sudden your project gets ranked up. So ranked up higher on the list. So with the $3.5 million that we raised that acquired that 138 acre tract, it's certainly our intent to give that to the state. No cost associated with, well, you know, there may be some deals with property boundary surveys and that sort of thing, but we're not selling it to them. We're trying to use it as an incentive for raising Atlantic Ridge ecosystem up the list. So where the sales tax comes in is if we're able to have that be successful in the fall, and we're going to come back to a lot of you who might be supporting this initiative asking for your assistance with that. The idea would be that sales tax will raise ballpark $20 million or so a year, And the county has identified those 4 project areas, one of which is the Loxa-Lucie. And so we would then take the revenue that has come in for that project. We'd essentially be offering it to the state, which would increase our ranking from number 29, hopefully up there high enough where we would be into some of the state money. And Martin County has been eminently successful over the years in using locally generated match for those kinds of other programs.
So along those same lines, one of our attendees wonders whether the recently approved Senate Bill 2508 would impact your project. Senate Bill 2508 has some big implications regarding Everglades restoration, the management of Lake Okeechobee, and the acquisition of lands here in Florida.
Yeah, I'm afraid I don't know a lot about the details, although certainly Eve Samples from the Everglades Foundation was there our Friends of the Everglades was there at today's meeting, and she provided some excellent comments, she and her organization up in Tallahassee last week on that issue. It's my understanding that 2508 was primarily related to the state's proportion of the funding for the Everglades agricultural area, the EAA, reservoir, and STA. And so while it's helpful for us because we don't want to have those discharges down the C44 and the St. Lucie River, it probably would not help us in the perspective of land money for land acquisition.
So one of our viewers is wondering if there's a specific way to designate their donation to the Conservation Fund to make sure it goes towards your project.
Absolutely, yes. If you go onto the Conservation Fund website to make the donation, type in their search bar LoxaLucie. It'll take you to a donation page, a secure donation page, and definitely put that in and say that it is for the Loxa-Lucie, and automatically it will be earmarked specifically for that project. Now, if people want to donate to other aspects of the project, they can also do it through that website, but we have other sort of needs. We want to do some educational videos, more outreach kinds of things, and almost all of the donations that we have gotten so far have been from people who want their money to go specifically for the land acquisition. But we've got these other needs about educational videos and things like that. Though so far we've applied for a couple grants and that sort of thing, but we certainly have a need for that, which is why we have created this Friends of the Loxa-Lucie to be able to allocate funds towards those kinds of tangential costs, but not strictly related to the land acquisition.
Greg, we're just about out of time. I want to finish with 2 comments from viewers tonight that really underscore just how complicated some of these issues are. One person says, "I'm just blown away. Martin County's growing without serious concern to the environment. Money talks." One point of view. And then another one of our viewers says, "There's a lot of discussion lately about how it's harder to build more affordable housing for an increasing population while keeping housing prices from skyrocketing. Yet communities resist an increased housing density." I mean, it really shows just how big of an issue this is when we have a state that is simultaneously working to undo a century of environmental damage and yet still fairly pro-growth with a stream of people moving in from other areas. So I think we gave people a great overview tonight on a local aspect of conservation and land preservation, but it really is a much bigger story that we can cover. I thank you for your time tonight. I'm really appreciative that you were able to hang out with us. And to our audience, I thank you as well. I hope we were able to answer most of your questions. And I hope to see all of you again 1 week from tonight, next Tuesday. Take care, everybody. Thanks again, Greg.
Thank you, Zach.